He handed me divorce papers while my father's casket sat downstairs. The image is simple and impossible to unsee. The folded paper in his hand, the white envelope, the way the fluorescent light of the Sunday school room caught the edge of the paper and made it look almost like a prayer. There were crayons on the table, bright scribbles taped to the wall by children who had been in choir that morning. Someone had left a styrofoam cup of coffee half drunk on the counter. Outside the window, neighbors hovered like punctuation marks. I remember thinking with a clarity that felt cruel and small that this was the most civilized place he could have chosen to humiliate me. My name is Jessica. I worked in medical billing. My father, Jason Hart, ran rentals on the side and kept a truck that smelled of old leather and sawdust. He collected mismatched mugs and could fix anything with a roll of duct tape in a stubborn refusal to call a professional. He was also, quietly and on his own terms, a planner. He liked to settle things before they became problems. That is the man I watched in memory as Brian, my husband of 8 years, sat across from me with an envelope that undid everything I thought I knew. We had been under strain for a while. Bills show up whether you are ready for them or not. I balanced co-pays and insurance codes while Brian bounced between contract jobs and grand promises. He smelt different most nights. Expensive cologne, a scent that didn't match any of his old sweaters or the truck he kept in our driveway. He said he was on site, that he had meetings. Little things piled into a pattern. The late vanishing, the defensive half-answers, a credit card bill misplaced on my desk. When something feels off, you look for the reason and tell yourself you're overreacting. That's how betrayal grows, quietly, in the spaces where doubt has room to breathe. It was a Monday afternoon that started with a routine envelope and became the pivot of everything. I opened a statement that listed, loud and bureaucratic, a new account in my name with charges totaling $8,400. That number looked obscene enough to make my stomach drop. There were vendors I had never called, a furniture store in South Portland, a chain of boutique hotels with receipts from nights I could place nowhere on my calendar. The credit card's billing address was ours. The account had been opened in my name. When I asked Brian about it, he laughed, too quickly, and said I must have opened it during an overnight trip I didn't remember. He said, "You forget things when you're tired," like memory was a light switch he could flip. I chalked it up to stress first, seconded that by grief because my father had been sick, and it felt inappropriate to say I suspected my husband of lying while we were supposed to be mourning. Saying it out loud felt like betrayal in itself. So I swallowed the suspicion and scheduled a meeting with the creditor and with our bank.
The next morning, my father called me before dawn and said, in a voice that sounded both urgent and oddly light, "Can you come grab breakfast? I have something I want to show you." He drove his faded pickup across town and slid into the booth like he had done when I was 10. He still had the same habit, an inch of room between himself and the ketchup bottle, a newspaper folded to the sports page. He kept his keys on a leather strap, engraved with the initials of his first dog. He didn't say much at the diner at first. He picked at the hash browns and watched me the way people watch television during storms, not wanting to be the one to speak first. Then he reached into his coat, my dad's coat, the one stashed by the back door with the grease stains near the pocket, and handed me an envelope. The edges were soft from handling. "Eleanor called," he said. Eleanor Hartwell, his estate attorney, had been a fixture at church for years. "She says you should have this." He smiled in a way that tried to be casual and failed. "Just read it, Jess." Inside was folded legal paper, tight and formal, documentation that 3 days earlier an irrevocable trust had been executed. He had done something that looked like foresight. He had placed his properties into a trust and named me the beneficiary. According to the documents Eleanor explained to me later, the trust structure was designed to protect the assets from claims that would arise if a spouse attempted to claim them as marital property. In plain terms, he had taken steps, quietly and deliberately, to keep his holdings out of reach if someone tried to use marriage to siphon them away. I sat there in the diner, the smell of coffee and syrup coiling up into my throat, feeling that same small, cruel clarity that had hit me the day of the papers. My father had been expecting danger and had tried to prepare for it. He hadn't said it bluntly. My father never offered explanations like that, but the paper did. 12 rental properties, an estate worth roughly $4 to $5 million, irrevocable trust executed 3 days before his death. Sole beneficiary, Jessica Hart. I cried at the diner. Later, sitting across from Eleanor in a sunlit office that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old leather, I learned what the words meant in practice. An irrevocable trust, Eleanor said, was a legal instrument that moves assets out of a person's personal ownership and into a separate entity. Once funded and executed properly, it can prevent those assets from being treated as part of a spouse's marital estate. That's a technical way of saying my father had limited the ability of a spouse to claim those assets in court. Eleanor was careful with her words. She explained the mechanics, the timelines, and the risks without judging or cheering.
She also told me what I had not wanted to hear, that executing the trust while one was still alive can sometimes provoke fights, especially when a spouse perceives themselves cut off from what they believed would be theirs. She didn't say the name Brian in that sentence, but it didn't need to be said. I left the attorney's office with a paper folder and a fog over everything I thought I knew about the man I had married. My father, by contrast, walked back to his truck with a lightness in his step that I mistook, briefly, for relief, like a farmer finally turning the soil before winter. 2 days later, he was gone. Funerals condense grief into a daylight hourglass. The chapel smelled of lilies and coffee. People shuffled in and out of the alcoves, sometimes speaking in too loud voices as if noise could dislodge sorrow. Pastor Williams read something about life and faith and quiet strength. My father's truck was parked out front, his jacket folded over the seat. We moved through the motions, viewing, prayers, the tight exchange of glances, until that small, bright avalanche of papers in the Sunday school room. Brian had gone to the funeral. He had been present at the viewing, hands folded, face set into a look people accept as appropriate. But at the reception, while casseroles cooled on folding tables and relatives tried to keep conversation ordinary, he walked into the Sunday school and sat down across from me. He placed an envelope on the table and said, with a smile that was all business, "You need to sign these." There were witnesses, people waiting in the next room to say goodbye. The children's drawings flapped on the wall like innocent banners. He said he had filed for divorce. He said it was time, that Mom and I should do the right thing for the estate, that my father would understand. He had an attorney with him, a man whose name I later learned was Derek Phillips. Derek spoke to me in patient legal syllables and placed a pen within my reach as if he were offering me a choice. My hands were cold. My heart felt like a fist. I signed. That sentence is a kind of hinge in the story. I signed while my family grieved, with an envelope between us and the sound of people arranging chairs like the slow turning of a clock. For weeks after, I replayed the motion of my hand and how easy the pen had been to hold. I asked myself what I thought I was signing then. On paper, it looked simple. A temporary agreement, paperwork that would ensure things moved along. In my memory, it is both a betrayal and evidence of the pressure people can exert when grief loosens the moorings of judgment. The first call after the reception was from my brother. He said something I didn't understand at first. "Dad set things up, Jess. He did it right. The trust. Eleanor has copies." I felt a strange, immediate relief, followed by a slow sickening. If the trust was real, it meant my father had tried to protect his legacy.
If the trust was real, it also meant that the paperwork I had just signed might be useless, or worse, part of a play to confuse the immediate aftermath. I left the reception early and went to a cheap hotel across town. I slept badly, vivid with dreams of my father's hands, of his truck, of the envelope with his handwriting on the outside, simple, neat, the way he wrote checks. I texted Brian things I did not mean. I received short replies. I called Eleanor again. She was calm and precise. "We have the trust documents on file," she told me. "There are timelines and notarizations. Your father signed the trust 3 days ago. It was funded properly. The deeds were all recorded." I repeated the numbers out loud like a late-night radio host. 12 properties, about $4 to $5 million in total. It felt absurd to do arithmetic while grief was still raw, but the facts anchored me the way details do when the emotional world is slipping. It was Marcus Chin, the private investigator, who presented the first other edges of the picture. I had been reluctant to hire anyone at first. I am not a person to escalate things quickly, and in the valley between anger and sorrow, I wanted to be careful. But then small things invaded. I found receipts in the recycling that didn't make sense. A neighbor told me he'd seen Brian moving boxes with a woman I didn't know. A package meant for one of the rental units appeared at our house with someone else's name on it. Suspicion became a pattern, and patterns demand answers. Marcus introduced himself in a coffee shop where the chairs were mismatched, but the cappuccino's good. He had a folder, like someone from a different era, full of Polaroids and time-stamped emails and a professional patience. He listened while I told him what I suspected. Then he said only what he always says. "Show me what you have. Let me look." The first thing he showed me was a map of timelines, a calendar with little annotations. Hotel 1023, charges 1102, van at 4th Street apt 1205, and then a line of connections that felt, in that dim glare, like a net coming tighter. He asked about 4th Street. I told him the story I had been given in Strands, a place Brian had rented to himself, a sublet he promised would cover things until his work came through. I had a copy of a note, somewhere in a box, that suggested he owed $47,000 for that arrangement, an amount he had dismissed when I asked, and one that suddenly looked like a pressurized leak. Marcus didn't judge. He folded a photograph from his folder and handed it to me. A picture of Brian had a closing, his arm around a woman I'd seen in blurry phone photos. "This is Vanessa," Marcus said. "She's a real estate agent. She's also been to your properties." The name felt like a splinter sliding free. The investigation grew methodically after that. Marcus pulled public records, he watched patterns of movement, he collected receipts.
He told me there are two kinds of evidence, the kind you can hold and the kind you can prove by pattern. I wanted proof you could hear. I wanted a voice that tied the pieces together. There were moments of vindication that tasted hollow. A landlord called to say a tenant's rent had been redirected to a different account. A bank sent a letter acknowledging suspicious activity. But these were small interim victories, the kind that do not stitch grief closed but give you a place to stand. Marcus promised recordings. He said without flourish that people who conspire often don't hide their voices from those willing to listen at the right time. Meanwhile, the house felt like a space that belonged to someone else. Tenants came by asking about rent, some with sympathy, many with questions. Maria from the corner unit brought me soup. Curtis and the Johnsons offered to sit with me so I wouldn't be alone. The tenants became a strange kind of family, witnesses to my father's legacy and uncomfortable observers of the fractures in my marriage. They handed me photocopies of checks and deeds and, in quiet, told me what they had observed. Community softened the edges of betrayal in a way that legal papers could not. There was a day that stands like a hinge in memory, a slow hotel-motel kind of afternoon that felt like the world had been filmed at half speed. I had the folder with the trust papers and the photocopy of the divorce I had been pressured to sign. I had a stack of emails Marcus had pulled that mentioned properties and spreadsheets and numbers. On top of it all, there was a voice message from my brother, which I played in the cheap hotel room with the TV turned off. "Jess," he said, voice unsure, "there's something else. Eleanor says Brian transferred the 4th Street account into his name 3 months ago, but the tenants never knew he was the landlord. We think he used that arrangement to funnel money. It's messy. Be careful." The word funnel in that context felt like a diagram of theft painted in Technicolor. I kept thinking about the $8,400 on the credit card I supposedly opened. What if that had been a node in a larger network? What if the credit line was leverage, a way to move funds around while leaving the victim standing in the room labeled Jessica? I found myself back at the attorney's office with papers spread around a table like a constellation. Eleanor moved between legalese and plain talk with a grace that felt like stabilization. She explained the difference between an irrevocable trust and joint property. She explained that while the trust could protect the properties from marital claim, it could not by itself stop fraud committed before the transfer was complete. If someone has already begun to appropriate funds or forge documents, she said, those may be independent criminal acts. She used the word alleged a lot, and I liked that.
It made the space between accusation and proof visible, and that space, I learned, is the work of hours and subpoenas, of investigators and timelines. We scheduled a quiet meeting for after the funeral. My father's death sat like a rawness under everything. At the viewing, people made the motions of consolation. At the reception, they joked too loudly, as if sound could sew a wound. And then Brian walked into the Sunday school with paperwork and authority and asked me to sign. The signature at the reception had consequences that took time to reveal. Derek Phillips, Brian's attorney, later called it a procedural move, an attempt to assert marital rights early, to get a foothold before the trust could be fully administered. In my chest, his phrase sounded like a clever animal's attempt to burrow under a fence. He insisted, Derek did, that what I had signed was merely a temporary separation agreement, not a legal declaration of any lasting claim. He said that signing in the moment did not limit my rights. The problem with signing under pressure is not law. The problem is human. Pressure shapes judgment. Pressure narrows the field of choices to the tiniest sliver that feels survivable in the instant. I had signed because the room smelled of lilies and casseroles, and because I had just buried my father. I had signed because the man who asked me to do so smiled and told me he knew what was best. It would take a while for the legal implications to sort themselves out, and even longer for my own sense of agency to reknit. That very night, the calls began. Derek's polite voicemail. A series of texts from numbers that tried for casualness. Let's just keep this respectable. Unknown numbers that turned out to be vendors who claimed to have contracts with me.
Every ping on my phone felt like someone trying to define what I owned and what I didn't. The credit card company called again. Eleanor called from her office to say she had filed an emergency motion with the county recorder to protect the deeds. Marcus sent a single message. I may have something. Can you come by tomorrow? I went. He closed the door to his office and pulled a USB drive from his pocket. I don't want to get your hopes up, he said, but I think you should hear this. He plugged it into his laptop and handed me a set of earphones. I remember the hum of the laptop fan and the way the sunlight across the desk felt suddenly like an interrogation light. There are certain moments you seek the truth, and certain moments the truth lands in your lap unasked. The audio began with casual talk, voices overlapping, someone laughing, someone else making a joke about closing costs. Then the tone shifted. A man's voice, familiar to me from Derek's announcements, gave practical instructions. A woman's voice, breathy and businesslike, spoke of accounts and transfers as if they were spreadsheet columns. There was a line, simple and unmistakable. Make sure it's in her name first, then reroute it.
The words were plain. They were instructions about how to create the appearance of legitimacy while moving the real value somewhere else. I lifted the earphones and looked at Marcus. Is that... I didn't want to say the name out loud. I was suddenly very small in a very large room. Marcus nodded. It's recorded from a place where they thought no one would be listening, he said. Time-stamped, September 14th. He handed me a printout of a ledger he'd reconstructed from bank statements. Charges, rapid transfers, a series of small deposits that looked to me like breadcrumbs. The problem with having proof is that it makes the situation legible, but not easier. The ledger was a map of the moves someone had made. There were dollars redirected, accounts opened, identities used, my identity among them. Marcus used the careful language all investigators learn: alleged, apparent pattern, probable cause. It sounded like a script made of caution. Why Brian? I asked. The question was both literal and existential. Why would the man I loved, or thought I loved, risk everything? Marcus shrugged. People do desperate things for money. People do greedy things even when they aren't desperate. He said it like a thesis and like a lament. My brother called that night. We need to be careful with who we tell, he said. People will pick a side fast, Jess. Be careful. His words were meant to protect. They also felt like a warning about how fragile support can be when the narrative involves betrayal. The rest of that week blurred into hearings and calls. Eleanor filed motions to secure the properties, to freeze any transfers relating to the estate. She moved with the quiet urgency of someone who had practiced in courtrooms and seen how quickly an advantage could slip away if you hesitated. At one point, a deputy came by to take a statement about the identity theft. I sat in my living room and walked through the events with a law enforcement officer who asked me to repeat dates and amounts and places. Saying them aloud in that tone made them feel not like things that had happened to me, but like components of a case file. And yet some things remained stubbornly private. My father's voice in my head telling me to keep the properties affordable for their tenants. His stubborn insistence when I protested that he could use the extra income to take a real vacation. His laugh when the oven burned a pie and he pretended it was a new recipe. He had planned for more than the contingency of greedy hands. He had planned for fairness. That, in the end, is what mattered to him more than numbers. There were moments of absurdity that cut through the darkness. At a meeting with a bank official, a clerk apologized profusely for the inconvenience of fraud checks, and then asked gently whether I wanted to set up online access to the trust account. In the same week that I found papers requesting my signature in the Sunday school room, I was also being given secure credentials to view the very assets someone had tried to touch. And there were the tenants. They were not collateral. They were people with stories. Maria, who had raised 3 kids in the back unit and who insisted on delivering a casserole even at the height of winter. Curtis, who worked nights and kept a watchful eye on the property. The Johnsons, who fixed sidewalk boards out of habit and insisted that rent not rise like a shutter in a storm. They became part of the defense of the legacy. Your dad wouldn't have raised the rent by half, Maria told me one afternoon, and her conviction felt like a warm bandage. Still, the betrayal cut through everything. The fact that the credit card fraud had amounted to $8,400 and that Brian had allegedly diverted rent money or falsified receipts was not simply a matter of money. It was a matter of trust, of the currency of marriage. When you are awake at 3 a.m., replaying the sound of the ballpoint pen signing a sheet, you don't only think of the sums.
You think of the seams of a life being unstitched. Marcus came back with more. He had followed leads to a person who tried to cash checks, notes that linked Vanessa to listings that overlapped with my father's properties, and bank routing numbers that duplicated patterns we had already seen. He told me quietly that people who plan fraud often assume they can control the narrative by being the first to speak, by filing claims, by making the first aggressive move in a legal skirmish. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. The Saturday after the funeral, I sat in front of my father's house with a coffee gone cold and the trust documents in my hand, and I thought about what he had done. He had made a choice to act while he could. He had not told everyone about the trust. He had put his faith in a structure and in me. That felt like both an obligation and a gift. Then my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, a photo of Derek and Brian at the reception, smiling too politely, and a caption, "She signed." For an instant, my chest narrowed. That night, alone in the house that had been my father's, I opened a file Marcus had left, a short audio clip, a transcript, and a series of timestamps. I played the clip and heard the murmur of voices in a conference line. I heard the same instruction I had heard a week before, but this time clearer. Make sure you open the card in her name. Make sure she forgets she opened it. We'll use that to justify some of the expenses. It was a cold, functional voice describing identity theft, the way someone else might describe a landscaping plan. I put the phone down and felt both rage and a strange relief. Rage at the betrayal, sure. Relief because the doubt that had been gnawing at me, the part that wondered if I had imagined things, was shrinking.
Proof has a way of reshaping grief into something more actionable. There was another thing I learned in that stretch. Grief and strategy can coexist. You can sit at an attorney's table and cry, then stand up and file a motion. You can mourn a man who planned for your protection, and at the same time, begin to fight the people who would have undone his work. They are not contradictory acts. They are the two halves of surviving. But survival is also messy. With paper and recordings in hand, with townspeople watching and tenants asking questions, it felt like living under a microscope. Brian sent me an email that began, "I'm doing this for us." Derek texted to say that the papers I had signed were standard, that disputes could be resolved without media. Vanessa moved her listings, apparently, and a real estate office removed her photo from their site. People shifted sides and then shifted back. Friends asked me what they could do and then vanished when the conversations turned heavy. At night, I read my father's handwriting in the margins of his Bible, the little shorthand notes he'd laughed about tenants who needed rent holds, about the woman across the street who could use a ride to church, about the savings he'd tucked away for a community project. My father's legacy suddenly felt less like a pile of bank records and more like a promise. It was a promise I was determined to keep. The work was only beginning. Marcus had recordings, but not yet a full mosaic. The bank had flagged suspicious transactions, but had not yet issued any final determination. Derek and Brian had legal strategies I had to parse. Vanessa's role was alleged. Her defense would, as any defense does, complicate the story. Arrests had not yet been made. Charges had not yet been filed. But the pattern, credit card fraud in my name totaling $8,400, alleged diversion of rents, questionable transfers related to the 4th Street sublet with $47,000 owed, was there, etched in ledgers and in the soft teeth of voicemail. I thought of the children's drawings taped on the Sunday school wall, and how those strokes of crayon were more honest than the adults who folded words into strategies. I thought of my father's truck, the low growl of its engine, and the way he taught me to change a tire. I thought of Marcus in the coffee shop when he said, "Show me what you have," and how that simple sentence asked me to believe that evidence could be found and meaning could be made. That belief, faith in facts, became the thread I followed. It was a sober faith, not the kind tied to temples, but the kind that trusts a ledger and a timestamp, and the slow work of law. My father's trust gave me a legal foothold and a moral one. He didn't want his tenants to lose a roof, and he wanted whatever means necessary to keep them secure. I drove to the property records office the next morning and watched with a strange practical attention as the clerk pulled the deeds and pointed to the chain of title.
12 properties, a cluster of duplexes and small apartment buildings that smelled of fried onions and laundry detergent, were indeed recorded as held by the trust my father had created. The official stamp on the recorded documents glowed like proof. Fundings dated days before his death, notarizations crisp and formal. They were there. That afternoon, at a community meeting in the parish hall, tenants gathered and asked for clarity. They wanted assurance that rent wouldn't double overnight, that leases would be respected,
that the woman who ran the corner store would still see the same faces every week. I stood up and told them what I knew, the bare bones, the practical, and I promised to keep rent reasonable. My voice was steady, because my father's voice was steady in my head. You take care of the people who live under your stewardship. In the end, everything accelerated and nothing resolved. The trust was there, the evidence began to knit into a pattern, and yet the emotional work, trust, anger, the rawness of losing a parent, remained unstitched. Brian's action at the reception had been a momentary seizure of the stage, but it had not been the final word. The letters and recordings and ledgers suggested a conspiracy that required more than a signature in a Sunday school room to undo. Marcus called late one evening and said simply, "You need to hear this next file. Meet me in the morning." I slept with the phone on my pillow, the way someone keeps a life preserver within arm's reach. I dreamed of the truck and the envelope, and of a future in which the tenants continued to hang wind chimes onto porches, and the Johnsons kept fixing the sidewalks. I dreamed, in short bursts, of returning the world to a gentler axis. Morning came like a span of possibility. The house felt quieter somehow, as if the trust documents and the small army of paperwork that now populated my kitchen table had made the world comprehensible. I went to Marcus's office, and when he finally slid another USB drive toward me, his face was plain. No triumph, no schadenfreude, only the look of someone who knows evidence when he sees it. When I pressed play that time, the voices were clearer, the names said plainly. There was a plan sketched out in a voice that sounded almost casual. "We'll set up the cards," said a woman I recognized. "We'll use her name, not his. That way we can justify expenses." The man on the line laughed. "She won't remember opening it. We'll say she did it to cover an emergency." I stopped the recording and sat with the silence. The rest of the story would require subpoenas and more recordings and the slow legal work that makes headlines dull and justice precise. There would be courtrooms and pleas, and perhaps even a judgment that would call some names by consequence. But that was ahead of me, like a road I could see, but had not yet traveled.
For now, I had the trust documents, the tenants, the audio files, and a community that believed my father had done the right thing. I had Marcus and Eleanor, and a brother who watched like a patient guard. And I had the memory of signing in a room that still smelled of lilies, an action that would haunt me, but also force me to act. There is a strange kind of clarity born from grief and evidence. It is not the clarity of triumph. It is a sober, disciplined attention to detail, an insistence that names be said, that dates be listed, that ledgers not be allowed to vanish into polite excuses. I gathered the folders into a bag and drove to the house where my father's truck still sat in the drive. The tenants were on their stoops, the same faces, the same small conversations about heat and school and the old maple in the yard. I felt for the first time since the reception a small concrete determination to follow the paper, to follow the recordings, and to protect what my father had worked for. When I paused at the gate, I remembered something else he had said once, in a voice that had seemed like a joke, but solidified into instruction. "If you're ever in a hole, don't stop till you get to the top." It was the sort of advice that made sense only after you had been digging for a while. Marcus called as I walked up the path. "There's one more thing," he said. "We've got a surveillance timestamp for a bank transfer. It lines up with a conversation you haven't heard." His tone was steady, no hint of drama, just the clinical flatness of someone who had seen patterns before. "Come by. Bring the trust paperwork." I looked at the house, the truck, the mailbox with my father's name still on it, and felt the weight shift from being acted upon to acting. The rest of the story was waiting. Legal steps, possible indictments, the question of whether the people involved would be held to account. For the first time in weeks, the future felt like something to shape rather than survive. I locked the front door and headed for Marcus's office, the folder heavy in my hands, and thought of the Sunday school crayons, the way those childish lines refused to be polished away by adult deceit. The world I had known had been rearranged, but the people in it, my father's tenants, my brother, even my bruised sense of self, were still there. I opened the car door and checked the folder one last time. The trust documents were there.
The audio files were waiting. The recordings Marcus had promised sat on a drive, and somewhere inside them was a voice that could tie the loose ends together. I pressed my hand to the leather of my father's jacket, left over from the viewing, and still leaning on a chair in the entryway. It smelled faintly of motor oil and old books. I thought of him at the diner handing me a paper and saying, without a parade or fanfare, that he'd done what he could to protect those he loved. If he had set a trap, I thought, it wasn't for vengeance.
It was for stewardship. And stewardship, I realized as I drove toward Marcus's office, is the work of staying present, staying accountable, staying to see what justice looks like when it is slow and bureaucratic and far from the clean arcs of revenge people imagine. Marcus slid the next USB across his desk and said, "This one ties a timestamp to a bank transfer that should not have happened." He tapped the screen like someone tracing constellations. It puts two people together in a way that looks, on paper, like a plan. I set the earphones to my ears and braced for the next set of voices. The play button was small. The room smelled like copier toner and old coffee. I hit play, and the voices came in clear this time. "Make sure the account reflects her," one of them said. "If it's in her name, it's easier to explain. She signed a form at the reception. She'll cooperate. People are soft when grieving." I'd heard the words before, but now they congealed into something more. They were not flukes on a ledger. They were respiration, breaths between plans. The plan was larger than a credit card, larger than a hotel bill or a sublet. It reached into the way people thought of marriage, property, and obligation. I listened, and an awful tenderness rose in me that I would later come to understand as the exact thing that made me fight. Not the money alone, but what the money could buy for others. My father had spent his life ensuring that the simplest things, a roof, a light, a stable rent, stayed within reach for people who could not afford chaos. The recording ended. Marcus folded his hands. "We can bring all of this to a prosecutor," he said. "But you should know, cases like this take time. There will be interviews and there will be denials. You'll have to hold on to this evidence and be prepared to tell the story again and again." I thought of Pastor Williams and of the Sunday school classroom, of the soft crayons and the bright paper. I thought of the weight of the envelope at the reception and of my father's careful handwriting. I thought of the 12 properties and the $8,400 in fraudulent charges in my name and the $47,000 tied to 4th Street. I thought, most of all, of staying. Marcus slid another envelope across the desk, photocopies, timestamps, a list of bank routing numbers. The world narrowed to the paperwork at my fingertips, a map of what might be a conspiracy. It was not yet a verdict. It was a direction. The next steps would be taken by prosecutors and deputies and clerks with stamps, by subpoenas issued in the name of the state. But I had a thing prosecutors like: pattern. I had witnesses. I had tenants who could say what had happened to them. I had a trust that my father had put in place precisely because he feared what greed might do. I left Marcus's office feeling both hollowed and steadied. There would be more calls, more files, possibly indictments.
The wheels of the legal system would turn slowly, but they would turn nonetheless. Before they did, I made a choice that surprised even me. I would not let the moments of shock define the remainder of my life. I would be present for the slow, bureaucratic work of untangling what had been done in my name. It felt somehow like honoring both the man I had lost and the man who had tried to protect us. If you care about financial safety and women's protection, consider subscribing. There are tools and stories ahead that might help someone you love. Prosecutors move when patterns are visible. My pattern was loud enough that Amanda Pierce, the county prosecutor assigned after Marcus brought everything to her office, agreed to open a formal investigation. Amanda did not romanticize anything. She asked for dates, for ledgers, for printouts, for the original credit card statements that listed charges I had never made. She asked for the recordings Marcus had captured. She wanted to see bank routing numbers tied to the 4th Street account and the emails that discussed how to make it look like expenses I had supposedly incurred. The first big break came when Marcus traced a chain of transfers that linked a shell account Vanessa had used to receive redirected rent. The transfers were clumsy. They hopped between 3 different small accounts before landing in one that had been used to buy furniture and pay for boutique hotel stays. The timestamps on the surveillance Marcus got from a bank, the same one that later froze a suspicious payout, lined up with the voices on the recordings. Suddenly, what had been a collage of suspicion and grief read like a plan. A prosecutor's team is not cinematic. It is administrative and relentless. Amanda and her investigators subpoenaed records, served depositions, and executed search warrants. Deputies took statements. Derek's calls to me shifted from polite to terse.
Derek insisted Derek was doing his job, that Brian's actions did not necessarily amount to the criminal conspiracy the audio suggested. The defense leaned on ambiguity and motive, but the state had timestamps, bank flow, and a threat of witnesses, tenants who'd had their rent checks redirected, a closing agent who'd seen documents signed in Vanessa's name that seemed to contradict the true ownership records, and the ledger Marcus had stitched together that showed the little daily breadcrumbs. I remember the morning deputies arrived at Vanessa's apartment. Marcus had told me she was likely to try to flee. He had seen the way conspirators sometimes panic when pressure comes. She did attempt to get away. Her name moved through the airport scanners. Agents intercepted a ticket under a slightly different name. She tried to board a flight. The arrest was not the cinematic chase in a thriller. It was a quiet, efficient encounter at a terminal where an officer read a suspect her rights and took her into custody.
When they brought her into an interview room, she asked for a lawyer. That is a person's right, and it was a small human moment amid the legal machinery. Ryan's arrest came later, after subpoenas and several rounds of interviews. He surrendered to detectives. There was a photo taken of him in a corridor outside the booking area that would become, unhelpfully, one of the things people circulated on social media. I asked Marcus not to forward anything incendiary. There was no dignity in his image being turned into a headline. Brian was charged with identity theft and fraud. The state's complaint cited the $8,400 on the credit card opened in my name, the pattern of diverted rent, and the odd movement of funds from Fort Street that aligned with the ledger of transfers. The documents used alleged until a plea or verdict changed that status, and Amanda and her team were careful to respect that line. There are small cruelties in being victim and public figure at the same time. People asked how I could marry someone who would do such a thing. People offered quick, moral answers. The nuance of betrayal wasn't trivial. For years, we had shared a life with pockets of normalcy and small kindnesses. That made the deception sharper. But none of that mattered to the prosecutor's work. The work wanted dates, signatures, and bank routing numbers. It did not ask about dinners or laughter. It asked whether the $47,000 that had been tied to Fort Street could be traced to a pattern of misdirection. It could. The indictments followed. Vanessa was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and multiple counts related to identity theft and fraudulent transfers. Brian was charged with identity theft and a number of related offenses. His attorney eventually came to me privately and suggested a plea might be on the table. It is odd to say this now, but the existence of the trust my father had set up made some decisions easier. Had the trust not been properly funded and recorded, the ledger would have been all the more dangerous. As it was, it provided a legal firewall that protected the core of my father's estate and gave prosecutors the time they needed to build their case without the added race to freeze assets. Courtrooms are strange places. They are fluorescent and solemn, and they flatten emotional highs into procedural rhythms. The first time I sat in a courtroom, I felt like an imposter in my own life. Amanda sat at the table with a printout of the ledger and a stack of USB drives. Derek represented Brian, and he was all calm, legal articulation, the practiced voice of someone who spends time arguing contingencies. Vanessa's attorney kept making procedural objections, as defense counsel must. I was called to give a victim impact statement. The most vivid part of litigation for me was not the numbers, though I would recite them. $8,400 of fraudulent charges, the $47,000 tangled in the 4th Street subliterating, but the effect.
I told the judge about mornings where I woke with the taste of the pen I'd used at the reception in my mouth. I told him about listening to recordings in a hotel room and hearing my name used like a ledger line. I told him about Maria and Curtis and the Johnsons, about a community that felt betrayed by someone who had once been part of it. I did not ask for vengeance. I asked for accountability. Brian's regret when he offered it was unmistakable and human. He was not theatrical about it. He did not seek to perform penitence. He visited me before his plea, in a room with a glass partition. I watched him through the reflection of a legal sign. He had lost 20 pounds. He looked smaller than I remembered. When he spoke, the voice came from someone I barely recognized. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean for any of this. I panicked. I thought I could fix things." It was an apology that contained both confession and excuse. It did not undo anything. It was unbearable because it was honest in a way I had not expected. For me, the apology did not feel like closure. It felt like the beginning of a long reckoning, one that would have to be measured by action, restitution, accountability, the rebuilding of whatever remained. Ryan pleaded guilty to several counts. He admitted under oath to knowingly opening accounts in my name and to participating in schemes to reroute rent. The plea spared him a trial, but not consequences. He was sentenced to serve time, ordered to pay restitution where the court could enforce it, and placed on supervised release.
The judge's language was measured, an acknowledgement of the harm, a sentence meant to reflect both punishment and potential rehabilitation. The criminal court gave victims nothing like a perfect resolution. It offered a legal response that was designed to protect the public and to hold offenders accountable. Vanessa's case proceeded to trial. The evidence against her, the transfers, the communications, the ledger, the recordings, proved more than patterns. Together they painted a picture a jury could follow. Witnesses testified. Marcus described the recordings and his methods in a way that was not showy but was precise. Bank representatives explained routing numbers and the unusual flags that had been raised when funds were split and redirected. Tenants told the jury how their checks had been handled and how in some cases they'd been asked to pay into accounts that were not the trust's. Watching a trial unfold is to see human beings try to make sense of documents. Vanessa testified in her own defense. She denied parts and explained others, and the jury listened. The verdict came back after a day of deliberation. She was found guilty on multiple counts and later sentenced to a term that sent a clear message about the seriousness of the scheme. Her attempt to flee made no difference at sentencing. In the eyes of the court, it was an aggravating factor.
After the dust settled in criminal court, civil work began. Eleanor led the way on the civil matters, motions to quiet title, suits to recover funds that could be traced, and aggressive work to ensure the irrevocable trust's intent was honored. There were settlement discussions. Some vendors agreed to accept partial restitution. Others pursued full legal claims. For every dollar the system could return, a dozen administrative steps had to be taken. I learned to read trust ledgers like some people read names in family Bibles. Numbers became the grammar of security. Restitution orders were written. The court tried to force the defendants to make the victims whole, but money is slippery once it moves across accounts. Vanessa's personal resources were limited. Brian's restitution was tethered to his ability to pay after release. The criminal sentences did not equate to full financial recovery, but they were public acknowledgments that wrong had been done and that the state would not ignore it. The legal resolution did not cure grief. It did not erase the memory of the Sunday school room, of the crayons on the wall, of the way my hand had moved across a paper while Lily smelt the room. But what it did do was reframe the narrative. No longer was the story an open wound in which suspicion could fester. It became instead a set of facts that I could use to protect others. One of the most unexpected responsibilities after conviction was what it meant to take stewardship of the properties. My father had not wanted speculative investors to rush in. He had wanted, plain and simple, housing that served the community. The trust appointed me as the steward for those assets. The trust documents were explicit. Do not raise rents beyond reasonable margins, prioritize long-term tenancy stability, set aside funds for maintenance, and create a mechanism to help tenants in short-term crisis. I could have sold everything. I could have cashed out and walked away. Part of me wanted to. A quieter, firmer part of me, shaped by my father's persistent morality, knew what he would have done. He would have stayed. He would have fixed leaky roofs and taught the Johnson kids how to fix a screen door. So I stayed. We held a community meeting in the parish hall. People came with skepticism, with weary hope, with questions about leases and maintenance, and whether the trust meant the landlords would keep the same values. I told them plainly what I intended to do. Keep rents reasonable, prioritize maintenance, and create a small emergency fund for tenants facing sudden job loss or illness. Maria, who had dropped casseroles at my door when I first lost my father, spoke for many when she said, "Your dad would like this." That sentence, simple and tender, carried the weight of continuity. The foundation grew out of necessity and intention.
I named it the Jason and Sarah Hart Foundation for Financial Empowerment. Sarah, as a nod to my mother, who had been quiet in the background and fierce in her own small ways. The foundation's mission was modest on paper and sweeping in spirit, to help women escaping financial abuse, to provide resources on identity protection and estate awareness, and to create a workshop program that taught tenants and community members how to read a lease, understand a ledger, and spot the early signs of economic manipulation. We launched the first workshop in the church basement, not far from the Sunday school room where I had signed under pressure. It felt fitting, somehow, to return the space to its original innocence. Colored paper and crayons replaced with handouts and a long table of sandwiches. Eleanor gave a short talk about trusts and why planning matters. Marcus spoke about patterns of fraud and how to secure digital identity. Amanda came and spoke not in prosecutorial terms, but in practical ones. How to report, where to go, who to call when something looks wrong. We started small. The first session drew 20 women. By the end of the first year, more than 200 people had attended workshops across the county. We partnered with local legal clinics and a credit counselor who taught budgeting without shame. The foundation offered a micro-grant program that could help someone cover the first month's rent when they left an abusive relationship or replace an essential item taken as collateral.
We preserved the 12 properties as a core corpus of the trust and set aside a percentage of net rental income to fund the grant program. The foundation did not feel like a triumph so much as a conversation that turned into work. Part of what helped me keep moving was the daily smallness of stewardship, fixing a burned-out porch light, negotiating a fair payment plan with a tenant who'd had a brief layoff, making sure the Johnsons could keep their garden boxes by providing new soil. Small acts are the plumbing of trust, mundane and necessary. There were messy moments too. Some of our plans required litigation in civil court to disentangle fraudulent contracts Vanessa had arranged. We recovered a portion of the $47,000 that had been siphoned through 4th Street, but not all of it. Some vendors were cooperative, others demanded full settlement. The law can remedy many wrongs, but not all the ways a family's interior life has been broken. I learned to accept partial victories. Community recognition arrived in small doses. An article in the local paper about the foundation, a profile on a public radio segment about identity theft survivors, a donated grant from a community bank that wanted to invest in affordable housing. None of that erased what happened, but it widened the circle of people committed to the promise my father had left. There were personal repairs that took longer.
I began therapy because I realized grief and betrayal had lodged themselves in my sleep and my speech, and the ways I agreed to small requests that felt like manipulations. I learned to say no. I learned to ask for documentation before trusting claims that involved money. I learned to listen to the quiet voice that had been warning me about the cologne and the vanishing nights for years. The first anniversary of my father's death was a morning full of quiet rituals. I went to the cemetery early and sat by his grave. I read from a card he had left in my drawer, a reminder to check the oil in the truck and to keep the porch light fixed. I did not expect fireworks of closure. Instead, I felt the weather of ordinary peace settle, small, steady, not triumphant, but enough. That day we held a community picnic. Tenants brought dishes. The Johnsons organized a small table of kids' crafts. Pastor Williams said a few words about stewardship and resilience. We launched a scholarship within the foundation to help one local student with books and fees for vocational training. I listened to laughter and shared conversation and felt at the edges of my grief a shape that could resemble repair. Justice, in the end, was not a clean line. Brian served time. He was released on supervised release after the term dictated by his plea agreement. Vanessa served her sentence and was later released under parole terms that included restrictions and required restitution payments where they could be enforced. Some of the money returned, some did not. Some people were satisfied by the state's response. Others wanted more. I felt a complicated relief tempered by a keen understanding that the law was only one instrument among many in restoring a life. The work I did afterward, the workshops, the calls with women who had found a pattern in their own marriages, the small grants that stopped evictions, gave the sorrow shape and purpose. I found myself meeting with other survivors who said, simply and plainly, "Your story made me look." The foundation became a conduit for practical support, pro bono legal clinics, partnerships with a credit monitoring service that donated memberships, and a spreadsheet of community resources that grew into a living tool. There were also moments of private tenderness that stitched me back together. My brother and I took on the maintenance together, lending hands when roofs leaked and swapping stories about our father until his laugh sounded less like memory and more like weather. Maria and Curtis would drop by with news or with a pie. The Johnson kids learned to cook, and sometimes I would catch the youngest trying to imitate my father's way of tightening a bolt on a screen door. As time passed, the narrative changed, in the way all narratives do. It became layered. There was a place for the Sunday school envelope in my memory that was not only betrayal.
There was also the diner paper my father had handed me, the trust that had saved roofs, the way a community rallied in small and meaningful ways. There was a foundation named for the people I loved, and a program that had helped more than 200 women recognize abusive financial patterns in their own lives. People sometimes ask if I felt vindicated when sentences were handed down. That question presumes that the heart wants validation from courtrooms. For me, the most honest answer is that I felt accountable. I had inherited responsibility and also the obligation to see justice pursued. It was never about savoring another's fall. It was about setting boundaries and making sure that what my father wanted, stable homes for his tenants, remained true. In the quiet between legal hearings and community work, I taught workshops to women who are making small, brave moves,
opening their first bank account in their own name, setting up two-factor authentication, learning to read a lease. We talked about the $8,400 charge as a case study, how identity can be weaponized, and how documentation and quick intervention can blunt that tool. We did not promise that legal outcomes would be the same for every person. We taught them where to go and who to call, and how to hold on to the documents that make prosecution possible. One evening, about a year after everything changed, Derek, Brian's attorney, reached out to say his client wanted to do restitution in a way that could be meaningful. He proposed that Brian engage in small, community-centered work as part of his supervised release, assisting with low-income home repairs under supervision, and with a nonprofit that helped men transition away from criminal behavior. It felt strange to consider this. Some people in the community would never accept such gestures. Others saw them as part of a restitution that went beyond money. I took a long time to answer. Ultimately, I agreed to let a supervised program proceed. The decision was not forgiveness. It was an attempt to channel a wrong into something that could maybe become less harmful. One thing I learned through all of this is that anger and compassion are not always opposites. Sometimes they sit next to each other on long nights. There were moments when I loathed what had been done and moments when I hoped someone would discover a way to change. That hope did not require me to forget. It required me to act. The foundation now has a small staff and a board made up of tenants, a local attorney, and a woman who runs a credit counseling nonprofit. We host quarterly workshops. We provide emergency microgrants. We help tenants understand leases and help families make plans for unexpected loss. We have kept rent increases modest and prioritized long-term leases for families with children. The 12 properties that my father had held remain a central corpus of what we steward. Sometimes people ask me whether starting the foundation was revenge. I tell them no.
Revenge seeks to punish. Stewardship seeks to preserve. The foundation is my father's intention made practical. He did not accumulate properties to profit off neighbors' misfortune. He held a modest fortune and used it to bind a small community together. That ethos is why I stayed. I do not tell this story to make anyone feel small or triumphant. I tell it because the structure my father built mattered. I tell it because the patterns we saw, identity theft, diversion of funds, forging legitimacy in someone else's name, are not uncommon. They are, sadly, how some people have learned to exploit relationships and legal technicalities. But they are also things that can be countered with paperwork, with witnesses, with community pressure, and with people like Marcus who follow the slow trails of money. The last time I saw Brian before he was released from supervised custody, it was at a small hearing where restitution arrangements were finalized. He looked old before his time. He did not ask for my forgiveness. He did not try to persuade me of his innocence. He said simply, "I'm sorry for what I did." There was no relief in that phrase for me. Only the recognition that some people must carry the weight of their actions themselves. What I carry now is steadier. I carry a ledger of what happened, yes, but I also carry the knowledge that my father's careful, quiet action, the trust he put in place 3 days before his death, made it possible for the tenants to keep their homes and for a foundation to exist that helps countless women gain the tools to protect themselves. I carry images of the Sunday school crayons and of the truck that smelled of sawdust. I carry the sound of Maria's laughter and the Johnson kids racing down the stairs to get candy at our community events. There are practical things for anyone listening who wants to be safer. Keep copies of important documents in a secure place. Check accounts regularly. Know your rights and your local resources for identity theft and domestic financial abuse. But know this too. Paper alone will not save you. Community will. A network of people who will notice when rent checks stop arriving, who will bring soup, who will file a complaint when something looks off. That is often what turns a scary situation into a solvable one. 1 year after my father's death, I walked back into the Sunday school room. The walls had been painted since then. The children still taped their drawings up in new patterns. There was a table at the back with pamphlets for tenants and a little sign-up sheet for the next workshop. I sat down and put my hand on the table where I had once placed my signature under duress. The pen marks of years faded into the varnish. I felt the strange contraction of grief and gratitude. Grief for what was lost, and gratitude that my father had thought ahead.
If the title of this story begins with what he did, handing me divorce papers at my father's funeral, it must also end with what he left: a trust, a community, and the small, determined work of rebuilding. The remorse of the person who hurt me was unbearable in its immediacy, but it did not define what followed. What followed was steadier: evidence collected, charges filed, people held to account,
tenants kept in their homes, and a foundation that teaches others to look, to document, and to protect. If this story has a practical end, it is this: protect your documents, build community, and don't be afraid to call for help. If it has a moral end, it is this: the best kind of legacy is one that asks you to stay and to care. My father did that for me. I am trying to do the same for others. If this story moved you and you want to help other women protect themselves from financial abuse, subscribe to the channel and visit the Jason and Sarah Hart Foundation. You can donate, volunteer, or sign up for a workshop. We are small and we are steady, and sometimes that is enough. Thank you for listening.